All right, let's dive into one of the most intense, most consequential periods in all of American history, 1844 to 1877. This isn't just an era that tested the American Union. No, it's the era that violently ripped it apart and then tried kind of clumsily to stitch it all back together. So, how on earth did that happen? Let's get into it.
So here's the big question we've got to ask ourselves. How did this really exciting dream of expansion, this idea that the US was destined to stretch from coast to coast, how did that turn into a total national nightmare? The best way to think about it, I think, is like a series of dominoes. One tips over and it just relentlessly knocks down the next, leading straight to disaster, and then an attempt to rebuild from the rubble. Okay, so take a look at this timeline. This is basically our domino chain at a glance. It all kicks off in 1844 with an election all about expansion. Boom, that leads right to the Mexican-American War. Gaining all that new land, well, that forces a super shaky compromise that, spoiler alert, totally fails. And that failure, it sparks the Civil War in 1861. The Union wins, it's preserved, but then the effort to rebuild the country, what we call Reconstruction, it all collapses by 1877. You can literally see how each piece knocks over the next. And hey, for all of you with the AP exam on your mind, you're going to want to listen up. This one period, this is a huge chunk of the test. We're talking anywhere from 10 to 17%. So yeah, knowing this stuff isn't just helpful, it's absolutely crucial if you want to nail that exam. So to really wrap our heads around all this, we're going to break it down into 4 parts, 4 big dominoes, if you will. First, the push, all about expansion. Then, the wobble, as the country stumbles toward disunion. Third, the crash, which is the Civil War itself. And finally, the rebuild, looking at Reconstruction. This is our roadmap. All right, let's tip over that first domino, the push. This is all about how that big, exciting drive to expand west ended up shoving the incredibly toxic issue of slavery right into the spotlight of American politics. And once it was there was absolutely no ignoring it. So what was fueling this big push? Well, it had a name, Manifest Destiny. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some dry political policy. Oh no, this was a powerful, almost religious belief that the United States had a God-given mission to expand all the way across the continent. And this quote from John O'Sullivan, the guy who coined the term, it just captures the whole feeling perfectly. He's not just talking about taking land here. He calls it the right of our manifest destiny, given by providence, another word for God. When you frame it like that, it makes expansion sound like it's not just a good idea, but that it's inevitable, that it's righteous. And this is where you see this huge disconnect between the idea and the reality. On one hand, the sales pitch was all about spreading liberty, democracy, and economic opportunity. But what actually happened? Well, a war with Mexico, the brutal displacement of native peoples, and here's the real kicker for the Union. It was like pouring gasoline all over the fiery debate about slavery. And man, that debate escalated fast. The war with Mexico adds this huge chunk of new land, the Mexican secession. Right away, you get the Wilmot Proviso, an attempt to ban slavery there that fails. This leads to this frantic scramble to hold things together, which gives us the Compromise of 1850. Every single one of these steps just hammered home the one question nobody could solve. Would these new lands be free, or would they be slave? Okay, so that brings us to our second domino, the wobble. After that first big push from expansion, the whole political system starts to get really unstable. It's like every time they tried to patch things up with a compromise on slavery, it just made the wobble worse, pushing the country right to the brink. You can basically chart this failure in 3 disastrous steps. Step 1, the Compromise of 1850. It included a really harsh Fugitive Slave Act that basically forced Northerners to get involved in slavery, and that radicalized a lot of people. Step 2, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This thing just blew up earlier compromises and led to actual fighting and bloodshed in Bleeding Kansas. And finally, Step 3, the knockout blow, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857. The court said African Americans weren't citizens and had no rights, which made any kind of political compromise pretty much impossible. The whole thing just fell apart. And this right here, this is what that collapse looked like. Look at the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency, and he wins it pretty handily in the Electoral College. But, and this is the really important part, he did it without winning a single state in the South. For white Southerners, the message was crystal clear. Their political power on the national stage was gone, evaporated. So, what's their next move? They leave. They secede from the Union. And you know what? they were incredibly upfront about why. Just read Mississippi's official declaration. They don't mess around with vague ideas about tariffs or states' rights. They just come right out and say it. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. I mean, it really doesn't get any more direct than that. And that leads us to the third domino, the big one, the crash. The political system is done wobbling. It has completely failed. Secession leads directly to the American Civil War, a brutal, bloody 4-year war that would decide the single biggest question. Would the United States even continue to exist as one country? Now, at the start of the war, the two sides were very, very different. The Union, the North, had these massive advantages. Way more people, most of the factories, the banks, the railroads. But the Confederacy, the South, they had some things going for them too. They were fighting a defensive war on their home turf, and especially at the beginning, they had some really strong military leaders. And their goals couldn't be more different. The North was fighting to hold the country together, while the South was fighting to break it apart and start their own. You know, for the first couple of years of the war, the North's official goal was pretty simple. Just preserve the Union. That's it. But then, in 1863, everything changes. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and this single document completely transforms what the war is about. And it had two huge impacts. First, it was a strategic move, a weapon of war. It basically invited enslaved people to flee to Union lines, which was a body blow to the Southern war economy. Second, it was a moral game changer. It turned the war into a fight for freedom. And that made it pretty much impossible for European countries like Britain or France, who had already outlawed slavery, to even think about supporting the Confederacy. So in the end, the Union's advantages in industry and sheer numbers, plus some key victories on the battlefield, were just too much. The Confederacy collapses in 1865. The war succeeded in its first goal. The Union was preserved. But it also accomplished something way more revolutionary. It destroyed the institution of slavery, a destruction made official and permanent with the 13th Amendment. And that brings us to our final domino, the rebuild. Okay, the fighting's over, the Union is saved, but now the country is facing these enormous, almost impossible questions. How do you rebuild the South? What does that even look like? And maybe the biggest question of all, what is the place of 4 million newly freed African Americans in this new United States? This period, known as Reconstruction, was this incredibly ambitious attempt to answer those questions, and it was a revolution that was left unfinished. And if you just look at the laws that were passed, the change was stunning. I mean, in just 5 years, you get 3 world-changing amendments to the Constitution. The 13th abolishes slavery. The 14th grants citizenship and equal protection of the laws. The 15th gives Black men the right to vote. This was a radical rewriting of what it meant to be an American citizen. But just like with westward expansion, we see this tragic gap between the promise and the reality. For every incredible step forward, like the Freedmen's Bureau offering protection or seeing Black men elected to office, there was this vicious, violent backlash. You had white supremacist terror from groups like the KKK, a new form of economic slavery called sharecropping, and in the end, the North just gave up. They politically abandoned the project, and by 1877, Reconstruction was over. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour, I know. So let's pull back and put it all together. What's the big idea? What's the one thing you really need to take away from Period 5, both for that AP exam and just for understanding American history in general? Just remember that domino effect. First, westward expansion pushes the slavery debate to a point where it can't be ignored. Second, all attempts at political compromise fail again and again, showing just how deep the division was. Third, that failure leads to the crash of the Civil War, which saves the Union and ends slavery. And fourth, the attempt to rebuild, Reconstruction, promises equality but is ultimately abandoned, leaving behind a terrible legacy of inequality that would take another century to even begin to address. And I want to leave you with this one final thought. That 14th Amendment, the one that guarantees equal protection, it was a promise that was completely broken in the 1870s. But then, almost 100 years later, that same amendment became the legal foundation, the seed for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So what does that tell us? What does a dormant seed of justice like that, planted in the rubble of the Civil War, tell us about the long, painful, but maybe, just maybe, hopeful arc of history?